She was 6 when they made her dig the grave. The dirt was hard, her hands were small. But the man with the rifle said, if she stopped, she'd be next. She buried her mother in silence, and when she was done, he took her sister. This isn't a story from some ancient world. It happened just over a century ago, under the same sun that rises now, on the same soil that so many still walk on. And yet most of the world has never heard her name, never read her words, never been taught what happened to her people. More than 1 million Armenians were slaughtered by the Ottoman Empire in 1915, not in battle, but by starvation, execution, rape, and fire. This was the first genocide of the 20th century, and still, to this day, it is denied. But memory is resistance, and tonight, we remember. If you believe in truth over silence, in remembrance over denial, subscribe, share. Let their voices be louder than the grave, because they tried to bury them, but we're here to unearth what remains. Chapter 1, Bones in the Dust. She stood at the edge of the village, her bare feet sinking slowly into the parched earth. The sun had burned the sky a cruel orange that afternoon, baking the hills until they cracked like ancient pottery. Around her, the whispers of the past clung to the wind echoes of a world already dying. She was 12, but the years had stolen her youth faster than the Ottoman soldiers had stolen her family. Her name was Ani, though names had begun to feel like fragile threads, icily snapped beneath the weight of what was to come. The orders had come quietly at first. Arrests in the dead of night, disappearances without a trace, men taken from their homes, dragged through the streets in chains, their cries swallowed by the cold stone walls of the city. Ani's father was among them. His deep voice, once the heartbeat of their household, was silenced by the clang of a cell door. Days later, a knock shattered the fragile calm in their home. Ani's mother, eyes wide and trembling, was told they were to be relocated. A word so empty it tasted like ash in their mouths. The soldiers spoke with practiced cruelty, their faces masks of indifference. They did not know they were sending these families not to safety, but to the threshold of oblivion. The march began at dawn. Ani's small hands clutched her mother's worn shawl as they joined the endless stream of villagers forced from their homes. The path stretched ahead like a wound in the earth, forgiving and unending. Women carried infants too weak to cry. Elders shuffled with shaking knees. Children's feet bled from sharp stones and thorny bushes. The sun beat down without mercy, as if it too had joined the killers in their cruelty. Days turned to weeks. The sky shifted from scorching blue to bleak gray, mirroring the hopelessness that settled in their bones. Hunger gnawed at their insides with relentless teeth. Water was scarce each sip, rationed like precious gold. Those who faltered were left behind, their bodies swallowed by the dust and silence. Ani's mother tried to shield her, but there was no sanctuary in this procession of death. One night, as the camp settled beneath a fractured moon, Ani heard the faintest whimper. A newborn, barely breathing, cradled in the arms of a woman whose face was a mask of despair. The child's cries were muffled by the wind, carried away before they could reach the hearts of the living. Ani's own throat tightened. The cruelty was not just in the taking of lives, but in the stealing of hope. At the edge of the desert, the marchers reached what they called the final camp. There was no food, no shelter, only endless sands that stretched to the horizon, waiting to swallow the broken dead. Lay unburied, their bodies twisted in unnatural poses. Ani knelt beside a woman who had collapsed, clutching her stomach, as if to hold the life slipping away within her. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, blood, and decay, a foul perfume of human suffering. Ani's mother whispered prayers under her breath, words meant for a god who seemed deaf. She braided Ani's hair, trying to preserve some thread of normalcy in a world unraveling. But even the braid could not hold back the storm. At dawn, the soldiers returned. Their faces were blank, eyes devoid of mercy. Orders were barked. Some were dragged away, never to be seen again. Ani saw her mother fall, struck down for asking where they were to go next. The girl's scream caught in her throat as the desert swallowed her cry. In the silence that followed, Ani realized she was alone. The nights were the worst. Cold settled over the sand like a shroud, and with it came the sounds, whispers of those lost, the rattling bones beneath the earth, the haunting cries that belonged to no one alive. Ani huddled beneath a tattered shawl, her breath shallow, heart a fragile drumbeat against the vast emptiness. She remembered the stories her grandmother had told, the ancient tales of kings and sultans, of empires rising and falling like the tides. But no legend had prepared her for this empire that devoured its own children, leaving nothing but bones in the dust. Days blurred. Hunger became a constant companion, its sharp pangs drowning out pain and fear. Ani scavenged what little she could, scraps of bread buried beneath rocks, bitter herbs from the sparse desert scrub. Each mouthful was a victory and a curse, a reminder of how far they had fallen. At one point, she stumbled upon a shallow grave, hastily covered with stones. She knelt and traced the outline of a child's hand pressed into the dirt, a silent testament to a life erased too soon. The weight of the silence crushed her, a grief too vast to hold. Yet, within that desolation, Ani found sparks of humanity flickering stubbornly. Fellow survivors shared stolen moments of tenderness, whispered lullaby, a shared piece of bread, a touch on a trembling shoulder. These small acts were defiance against the abyss, fragile lifelines in the storm. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Ani heard the distant rumble of hooves. Soldiers appeared on horseback, faces obscured by dust and shadow. They rounded up those still able to walk. Ani clutched her shawl tighter, heart pounding like a drum in a funeral march. The executions were swift and brutal, gunshots echoing across the dunes, bodies falling like broken statues. She turned away, tears carving rivers down her dirt-streaked face. The air was thick with smoke and sorrow, the ground slick with the blood of those who would never see home again. When the soldiers rode off, Ani stumbled toward a cluster of survivors huddled beneath a twisted acacia tree. Among them was an old man, his face carved with lines deeper than the canyons around them. He spoke softly, words that cut through the despair like a blade. They want to erase us, but as long as one remains, we live. Ani clung to those words as she did to life itself. Weeks later, a small band of survivors found a way to escape the desert's cruel grip. Ani was among them, her body frail but spirit unbroken. They walked into villages that whispered rumors of what had happened, faces turned away or glazed with disbelief. The world was vast, yet their suffering was a secret carried only in their bones. She would never forget the faces left behind the mother who sang lullabies to empty cradles, the children too tired to cry, the silent graves marked only by stones and prayers. Their stories were written in dust and blood, in the quiet spaces where memory fought to survive. Aina's journey was just one thread in the tapestry of horror that stretched across a continent, yet her voice, though faint and fragile, became a beacon for those who refused to let history fall silent. In the years that followed, survivors scattered like ashes in the wind, carrying the weight of loss and the fire of remembrance. They rebuilt shattered lives from the ruins, whispering the names of the dead, so that the bones in the dust would not be forgotten, because to forget is to kill again. And Ani, the girl who once dug a grave with trembling hands, would live to tell their story. Chapter 2. Echoes without graves. The guns fell silent, but the silence that followed was no relief. It was a hollow echo, stretching across borders and decades, wrapping itself around the survivors like a cold shroud. The Armenian Genocide did not end with the last body buried in the desert sands or the final screams swallowed by the night. It continued quiet, insidious, relentless in the spaces where remembrance should have been, in the faces that refused to look, in the words that were never spoken aloud. What happens to a people when the world refuses to acknowledge their suffering? When the maps redraw themselves, wiping away entire homelands, and the names of villages are replaced with new ones, as if to erase the very memory of those who once lived there. For the Armenians, this was their cruel inheritance. A homeland that had nurtured them for centuries was transformed into a land of ghosts and silence. Cities where churches once stood now bore the scars of fire and ruin. The vineyards and orchards were left to wither. The language that once filled bustling markets was muted beneath foreign tongues. The international response was an unsettling mix of shock and indifference. Reports filtered out, sometimes smuggled by missionaries, sometimes whispered by diplomats, but often fell on deaf ears. The Ottoman Empire's actions were cloaked in the fog of war, dismissed as internal strife or necessary security measures. Political interests overshadowed humanitarian outrage. The young Turkish Republic that rose from the ashes of empire carried forward a legacy of denial, refusing to recognize what had been done. Laws were passed, silencing any who dared speak the truth. Families who mourned openly risked persecution, forcing grief underground. Survivors scattered across continents, their footsteps tracing painful patterns from one exile to another. In the diaspora, communities built fragile refuges of memory and culture, striving to keep their history alive amid foreign lands. Yet, the scars of trauma were deep. Children grew up with tales of lost parents and vanished homes. Orphans, like Annie, once a girl buried in the dust, became carriers of a collective sorrow too heavy to bear alone. Myths and rumors took hold in these fractured life stories of secret caravans that escaped, of hidden caches of artifacts, of lost manuscripts buried beneath rubble. Yet, alongside hope flickered despair. Many wondered if their suffering was destined to be forgotten, if their dead would ever have graves, if their pain would ever find justice. Denial became a second genocide, a slow, relentless erasure of identity and truth. The denial was not only political, but deeply personal. Armenian families were forced to rewrite their histories, to change names, to hide their heritage beneath layers of fear. The trauma was inherited, passed down in silence from generation to generation. This shadow legacy shaped identities in exile, a constant negotiation between remembering and surviving. Yet, even in this darkness, there was resistance. Secret schools taught the Armenian language in basements and back rooms. Hidden churches kept flickering candles alive against the night. Survivors recorded their testimonies in quiet desperation, desperate to leave a trace before their voices faded forever. Scholars began piecing together archives, tracing the threads of a truth that tyrants sought to unravel. Memorials began to rise, silent stones marking the absence, sites where names were inscribed to counteract forgetting. These monuments became battlegrounds of memory, contested not just by history, but by politics and denial. Annual commemorations gathered thousands, each candle lit a defiance against the abyss of silence. And yet, questions lingered, heavy as the dust that once covered the graves. How does a world reconcile with such horror? How does a people rebuild when their roots have been severed? What justice is possible when perpetrators deny and victims are scattered like seeds in the wind? The Armenian Genocide left wounds not only on bodies but on history itself, ruptures in the narrative that challenge us to confront uncomfortable truths. It forces us to ask, how many more bones lie beneath the dust of forgotten atrocities? How many more voices have been silenced by denial and neglect? In remembering the Armenian Genocide, we confront the fragility of memory, the cruelty of power, and the resilience of the human spirit. Annie's story, the girl who dug a grave with trembling hands, is but one thread in this larger tapestry of suffering and survival. Her voice, and those of countless others, call out across time, demanding that we bear witness, that we listen, that we never forget. Because to remember is to resist, to speak is to survive, and to acknowledge is to begin healing.